Just
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, good evening and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And thanks for joining us here online, where we've been able to move many of our events in response to the current pandemic and continued need for social distancing. With Crowdcast, which is the platform we're using this evening, you can see us, but we can't see you. And you can still ask a question. To do so, just click on the Ask a Question icon at the bottom of your screens. And there you'll also see a green bar to purchase this evening's featured book, which is Donald Trump and His Assault on Truth by the fact checker staff at the Washington Post. The fact checker column first appeared in the Post back in 2007 and was focused then on the 2008 presidential campaign. The column was revived as a permanent feature in 2011 by Glenn Kessler and became famous for rating falsehoods with Pinocchios. 1 Pinocchio for minor shading of the facts, 4 for outright lies. But nothing had quite prepared the truth-squatting effort for the sheer scale and brazenness of Trump's mendacity over the past few years. By the Post's latest count, Trump has made more than 19,000 fallacious statements since taking office. In their new book, the fact checker team examines a number of the president's most frequent distortions and most dangerous deceptions. Their book, like their Post reporting, provides an essential resource for all of us trying to keep our own eyes on the truth and avoid being blinded by Trump's blatant and repeated disregard for it. Today, Glenn Kessler remains the fact checker's editor and chief writer. His own journalism career has spanned more than 3 decades, including 11 years with Newsday and 22 years with the Post, during which he's covered foreign policy, economic policy, the White House, Congress, politics, airline safety, and Wall Street, a wide range of experience that's contributed to Glenn's ability to keep tabs on many subjects for the fact checker. I watched Glenn operate up close when he and I overlapped at the Post and can attest to his great reporting skills, particularly his keen attention to detail and abiding sense of fairness. But the fact checker long ago ceased to be simply a one-man operation. And also here this evening with Glenn are 2 other members of the team. Salvador Rizzo, who before joining the Post a couple of years ago, spent time covering New Jersey politics during stints at the Star-Ledger, the Bergen Record, and the New York Observer. And Meg Kelly, who's both a reporter and video editor for the fact checker, and before joining the Post several years ago, covered the 2016 election for NPR as a visual producer. So Glenn, Sal, and Meg, the screen is yours.
All right, very good. Well, I'm glad everyone is here. This book, we've been living the presidency of Donald Trump since it began, and we spend every day going through and fact checking not only his claims, but also claims of Democrats and other members of Congress and advocacy groups. And, we live it day by day. When we finished completing this book, it was still a shock to us to see what we had actually, written about, because you forget about it. The president says so many things that are so often false. It's averaging about 22 claims a day that I think most people, when they actually get through what we've written, will be very surprised. And the book is written, as a way you can read it from cover to cover. You can also dip into sections that are of interest to you, because we try to write it so that each chapter stands on its own. And each of us was responsible for different chapters. So what we're going to do in this presentation, we'll just take you through the book. I wrote the introduction and describe that, and then we'll go through each chapter. We'll give a little summary. We'll highlight 1 or 2 or 3 of the particular claims that we find of interest in that chapter. and then we'll be really happy to take your questions. So the thing about presidents is that every president lies. I mean, at some point. I mean, they might do it for national security reasons. They might do it because they're trying to cover up something of personal embarrassment. You think of, the Monica Lewinsky scandal. There's the lies or falsehoods that are marketing fluff, such as when, you think of Barack Obama's, if you want your plan, you can keep your plan thing. And generally, each president is known for one big lie. One of my favorite presidential statements is Dwight Eisenhower, generally regarded as one of our better presidents, who approved a series of statements to cover up the fact that the United States had U-2 flights over the Soviet Union, because he assumed Gary Powers had been shot down and killed, and he could cover it up. He wasn't. They found the pilot as well as his plane, and it was a huge propaganda victory for the Soviets. And Eisenhower was later asked what his greatest regret as president was, and he answered forthrightly. He said, "That lie we told. We had so much damage from that lie." But as we write in the book, I just want to get this right. We say, and then there's Donald Trump, the most mendacious president in U.S. history. He almost never expresses regret. He's not known for one big lie, just a constant stream of exaggerated, invented, boastful, purposely outrageous, spiteful, inconsistent, dubious, and false claims. And as Brad mentioned, we're now up to 19,000 and counting of these claims. The book, when we started the book, it was the end of his third year, and it was 16,241. We actually had to scramble to add we wanted to end with January 20th, but we had to scramble to add a coronavirus chapter for obvious reasons. The interesting thing about Trump is that, he says things that are false for things that are big and small. He had a reasonably successful economy before the coronavirus hit, and yet, amazingly, he would exaggerate about that. He would routinely add 600,000 jobs when he talked about how many jobs he created. Now, there's no real reason to do that. He's also unusual in that a lot of his falsehoods are used to denigrate people and put himself in a better light. I'll just read one more little item from the introduction, which is maybe of interest. There was a social scientist at the University of California in Santa Barbara. She took our database the first year and studied it, looking for patterns of lies. And she said, ordinarily, about half of the lies that people tell are self-serving, and compared to a quarter that are told to advantage, flatter, or protect someone else, and only a tiny percentage of falsehoods are mean-spirited. But it turns out with Donald Trump, 2/3 of Trump's falsehoods were self-serving, and only slightly less than 10% were meant to be kind. That means he tells 7 times as many self-serving lies as kind ones. And then, usually people who tell lies, hurtful or disparaging lies, are 1% to 2% of the total lies they tell. In terms of Trump, it accounted for 50%. And she said that when she saw that, she literally gasped when she looked at her computer screen. So that's the state of our president and our presidency. And now we'll take you through the book, the first chapter, which is our cataloging of Trump's biggest whoppers, was written by Meg.
Yeah, so as Glenn just mentioned, President Trump made more than 16,000 claims by the time that we started this book. And consequently, sort of narrowing down what the most important 10 claims were, the top claims, the biggest whopper, became quite a challenge, because we needed to draw from sort of all aspects of his presidency, his main policy priorities. And so we decided that it sort of should represent his biggest themes for the presidency. I won't walk you through all of it, but what we sort of pulled out a few trends that really stuck out to me as I was writing the chapter. So the chapter is divided into it did it, or I did it, it wasn't me, and they did it. And it sort of reflects the way that the president deals with most topics. Either he's claiming credit for something that didn't happen or hasn't happened or didn't happen on his term, or he's deflecting something that's completely obviously truly happened. And I think sort of the most clear or disastrous example of this is the way that he dealt with claims around Stormy Daniels. And I think, and Glenn, correct me if this is wrong, but this is the only time we've ever labeled something officially a lie, because we could prove that he, in fact, knew that he was being deceitful at every step of the way.
At least the only time in the pages of the Washington Post.
Yes, only time in the pages of the Washington Post. And so, just to sort of jog everyone's memory, basically Trump said, and I'm just going to read this to make sure I get it correct. You'll have to ask Michael Cohen. A reporter asked him, did Michael Cohen make the payments? If there was no truth why did Michael Cohen make the payment if there was no truth to her allegations, referring to Stormy Daniels? And Trump said, you'll have to ask Michael Cohen. Michael is my attorney. You'll have to ask Michael. The reporter said, do you know where he got the money to make that payment? And Trump said, no, I don't know. And essentially what we wrote about that is that every answer was false. Trump knew about the payment. He knew Cohen made the payment. He knew it was an effort to kill a damaging story. And he knew that Cohen was reimbursed for laying out the hash money. So each piece of that was demonstrably false. And it was a clear example of all of the evidence being there and Trump sort of saying, it wasn't me, I didn't know, how would I know that? So I'm just gonna go ahead and turn to the second chapter, which I also wrote because I feel like it's a good transition. It's all about Trump on Trump. And essentially the thing that's sort of unique about Trump is that he exaggerates or makes false claims about almost every part of his life. So, it starts with where his parents are from, how well he did in college, and sort of moves all the way through his business career, through how successful he was, and sort of his personality, what he cares about, and straight through to the presidency. So his approval rating, how well people perceive him, who he has won political fights against in the past. Given what's been going on in the last few days, I kind of want to highlight a couple of different pieces that are from the first section, which is about Trump, the man. The first one is a personal favorite of mine and is not connected to what's happening in the news at all at the moment. But Trump has a habit of talking about Cincinnati every time he's in Cincinnati. And, the first time I heard him say this, I was like, Trump, synonymous with New York, developer, why is he talking about growing up in Cincinnati? And so he often exaggerates, saying, that he worked there, he lived there for a long time, he spent a big summer there. And essentially what happened is his father had bought a development there while he was in high school, and he would occasionally go with his father to do some menial tasks around that development. But his suggestions that he sort of like really knows the city and is a Cincinnati guy are just deeply misleading. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, and to some extent goes hand in hand in that, is I think folks have probably seen the president say that he's done more for the African-American community than any other president in his term. He also has a habit of saying that he's the least racist person ever. And one thing that we did in this chapter is sort of run through a series of events that sort of debunk that very vociferous statement. And I think it ends with earlier, I guess it was late last year, when he invoked the sort of go back home trope, speaking to 4 Democratic minority congressmen, and Marty Baron, who's our executive editor, essentially came out and said, hey, this is a years old racist trope. But this was certainly not the first or the last time that Trump has waded into hot water when it comes to race. And I think Sal wrote the 3rd chapter.
Right. So I wrote the 3rd, the 4th, and the 6th chapter and the appendix. And there's a common theme that I think runs through all 4 of these pieces of the book. And that is, the psychology of Donald Trump when he is at his most pugnacious or combative, right? Because chapter 3 is all about, the falsehoods that he tells about his perceived and real political enemies, right? People like Robert Mueller, Nancy Pelosi, John McCain, Jim Comey. Chapter 4 is, the stuff that he tells, people in his base, often during his very boisterous rallies, where the number of false claims is just like nothing you have ever seen before from a politician. We've actually measured the rallies, and I'll get to that in a minute. And they are a spectacle of politics like we have never seen, and they don't do well when you start to measure how truthful the president is being. And then I had chapter 6, which is immigration, and that is the category that President Trump most often, out of our 18,000, 19,000 claims, I haven't checked recently, but immigration consistently is the top category for false and misleading claims. So in a lot of ways, I feel like I went to the deepest, darkest part of the jungle here and lived to tell about it. So if I could do it, so can America and the country. And that's why I think, the book is a great public service, as some have noted, because like Glenn said, you forget a lot. You forget that Donald Trump has been, smearing Joe Scarborough since 2017. Right. I had totally forgotten about that until 3 weeks ago, the president started up all over again. And unfortunately, that's just such a disgusting and, sort of vicious lie that is based on absolutely nothing. But we didn't think we didn't have the wherewithal to remember it when we were writing the book. And so it's not in the book because it's from 2017. It's from ages ago in Trump land. He only
said it. So
he had only vaguely suggested it once in 2017, and now it's all over the place on his Twitter feed, and he won't stop talking about it. He was just on Fox News Radio this morning. And I just want to note, there is nothing to this conspiracy theory. The National Enquirer would not touch it. We learned that today from the Daily Beast. So that tells you something, because they will touch a lot of things at the National Enquirer. And so let me just give you an example of the kinds of fact checks that we would do for chapter 3, which is the chapter on his enemies. And before impeachment, before coronavirus, before the riots, the Russia investigation took up a lot of oxygen in DC, certainly around the country, in terms of news coverage. Since the campaign ended, basically, we had, a constant drip of stories. And now Trump is very incensed about it. But he has said so many false and misleading things about the Russia investigation that it's hard to take any of these latter-day complaints seriously when they're spinning these documents coming out as part of court cases into something that they're not. And the record for Trump is so checkered. So, for example, about Robert Mueller, Marine veteran, longtime director of the FBI, a guy who's been respected by both parties for a long time and has done a lot of public service in his life. Donald Trump would just hammer Robert Mueller on a near daily basis on Twitter in public remarks with false and misleading claims. He would allege that Robert Mueller and he had a business dispute going back several years, and therefore Robert Mueller had a conflict of interest, and that would disqualify him, from investigating the Trump campaign. But what Trump describes as a conflict of interest, his own aides, including Steve Bannon, describe as petty and ridiculous. Robert Mueller was once a member of a Trump golf club in Virginia. He hadn't been using it for years and years because he was living and working in the district, apparently. And at one point, he tried to get a refund from the club. And, he and the club manager, by all intents and purposes, it looks like a very cordial back and forth between them. And then I guess Robert Mueller gave up on the refund, and that's it. And Trump spins this into, some business dispute and a conflict of interest. He also claims about Robert Mueller that he had a separate conflict of interest because he was interviewed to be the FBI director when Trump had just fired James Comey, the reason for the Russia investigation the catalyst for the Russia investigation. But actually, what you see in the Mueller report and what we put in the book and what we fact check so many times because the president says it constantly, Robert Mueller went to the White House to speak to Trump and some aides to give them an institutional perspective of the FBI director's job. He wasn't applying for it. And apparently it was clear enough to all of Trump's aides, including Steve Bannon, just not to Trump. So that's a very prominent example of Trump spreading misinformation about one of his political foes, or in this case, antagonists. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, gets on his radar very often. And often when you're hearing Trump making some outrageous or, incredible claim about Nancy Pelosi, there's not much there when you start scratching. And so the example that we put in the book was Trump, he at one point made some comments. This was early in his presidency, and it wasn't clear whether he was talking about immigrants in general or the gang members from MS-13, right? The way that he had sort of proceeded through his remarks, there was an ambiguity there. And most people, reasonably, I think, if you're looking at the remarks, would conclude that he was talking about immigrants, and he called them animals, right? And then later on, he returns to the theme of MS-13 and how this gang is very violent. So he calls some group of people animals. The next day, while it's still ambiguous, Nancy Pelosi, sort of reprimands him and says, like, no human should be called an animal, and everyone has a spark of divinity, and he should realize that. And then, Trump clarifies after that. He was talking about MS-13, but for years and years, he's been trashing Nancy Pelosi for criticizing him, for, supposedly censuring him on calling MS-13 animals. She never did that. She was still in, the mindset that he was talking about all immigrants, as the rest of us were before he clarified his comments. So those are two examples. There's a lot more. We didn't include Scarborough, but you get a sense of the sort of stuff that we delve into in this chapter. And I'm going to quickly segue to chapter 4, which I also wrote. And that is, we titled it Boasts to His Base. Often what you'll find is that, you look at the people who go to Trump rallies and they've been interviewed, or, some events at the White House and, they're catered to the religious right and you have a lot of Trump supporters there. And what you find is that a lot of them are not very perturbed about the president's record, with false and misleading statements. And in fact, a lot of them, when you ask them point blank about it, they'll say things like, well, I don't really take it seriously, or, I know he's fibbing a bit. So it's hard to tell, how many of the president's supporters are actually believing every single word he says, and how many have a more jaundiced view, but maybe they still support him for other reasons that have nothing to do with whether he tells the truth or not, or whether, he is misleading them on some issue or not. And so, we crammed a lot of economic and, jobs claims into that chapter, but 3 of them that really stand out, and I'll just go through them quickly. I won't go far into detail. One of them is the claim that he, quote unquote, decimated Obamacare or virtually eliminated Obamacare, right? What actually happened is he and Republicans in Congress reduced one part of Obamacare, the individual penalty, and that was basically a tax on people who declined to buy health insurance for that year. And so Trump managed to reduce it to 0, right? But the rest of the law is still there. The exchanges are still there. Millions of people still have insurance through the exchanges. The Medicare expansion is still there. A bunch of states get billions of dollars from the federal government to run their Medicaid programs through that. The guarantee for, coverage for pre-existing conditions is still there. It's a huge plank of Obamacare. The Trump administration is in court trying to get rid of it, but for now, it's still part of the law. Secondly, I'll just go briefly into, another kind of claim in that chapter, and that's this claim that he repealed the Johnson Amendment, right? So the Johnson Amendment forbids 501c4s or charity organizations, 501c3s, from taking political stances in support or opposition of candidates because they're nonprofit. And so they don't pay taxes, they don't get to participate in supporting or opposing candidates. That's the trade-off. Importantly, the state of New York sued the Trump Campaign and Foundation for a violation of the Johnson Amendment. And now Trump is, making this for Pinocchio claim that he has repealed it, when in fact, it's still the law of the land, it's still on the books, it hasn't been repealed. Trump signed a very, very I've seen a lot of executive orders in my day. This was, a bunch of fluff. It really doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any teeth. The Johnson Amendment may not be enforced very toughly by the IRS, but it's still there. And, Chapter 5, I'll hand it back over to Glenn.
Yeah, actually, 5 is Meg, Twitter.
Oh, sorry.
We want to leave room for questions, so we'll probably whip through the last ones a little more quickly.
Yeah, I'll be fast. Similarly to the first 2 chapters, this was another case of spending a lot of time in Trump's head. It's a chapter all about Twitter, which is the president's preferred communication platforms. One thing that really struck me was that, a third of his false and misleading tweets were all about impeachment or the Russia investigation. So very much focused on things that were hurtful to him. And if you look back to sort of his time before being president, it was very much like a punching bag of his thoughts on anybody political. So he would go after Obama on a regular basis, which he still does, amongst other topics. It's also sort of like a catalog of flip-flops. So essentially, almost in any situation, you can go back and find a tweet where he criticizes someone else for doing something that he's currently done. One that is very straightforward and really stuck out to me was in 2012, he wrote 3 chiefs of staff in less than 3 years of being president. Part of the reason why Barack Obama can't manage to pass his agenda. Of course, at the end of December 2018, Trump was moving into his 4th chief of staff, which I think sums things up. So Glenn, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, well, this part of the book gets very much into the issue chapters. Sal did the first one, which was on his falsehoods about immigration.
Right. So I probably don't need to go through, the background here. The president campaigned on immigration. He has been perhaps the most, at least in the modern era, the toughest president with his rhetoric on immigrants. And what we consistently see when he makes, these big claims about immigrants being associated with higher crime rates, with, ascribing to, members of the Central American caravan, that they're part of the drug trade, that there are terrorists among them. It is the one thing that, he constantly is fear mongering on, and especially as elections seem to approach. We see this, when his first election was approaching, when the congressional midterms were approaching. Who knows if he'll make it a central plank of his re-election campaign as we get closer to November. But I want to talk briefly about 2 issues that we delve into in the immigration chapter. And they are, we delve into a variety of claims, but these are sort of the big ones. And the first one is the idea that immigrants cause crime and that they're associated with higher crime rates. And first of all, it's very hard, to measure the proportion of undocumented immigrants who are doing anything because, how the Census Bureau captures some of them, but some people complain that that's not thorough enough because it relies on self-reporting. So it's a big question mark in a way, but there have been a lot of academic studies. And what you consistently find is that there's no association between immigrants and higher crime rates, or cities or counties or regions where immigrants tend to settle and higher crime rates. In fact, crime tends to go down in communities in the United States where immigrants tend to settle as a group. And very tellingly, I've always found this statistic to be very telling, and I don't see it out there often enough, so I try to repeat it often, and it's one of the first things that we go into in the chapter. During the 30-year period between the late 80s and mid 2000s, the number of undocumented immigrants tripled in the United States, right? And violent crime rates were cut by half, both property crime rates and violent crime rates. Sorry. So you're talking about this mass influx of tens of millions of people coincided with a huge drop in crime. It just suggests that there is no real association. The president just has no interest in, educating himself, I guess, about this topic, because for years and years, it's been a canard of his that he likes to repeat. The other one that I'll mention briefly is this idea that Trump and many members of the administration were suggesting in mid-2018 that they either didn't have a family separation policy at the border, or that existing laws and court precedents force their hand and require the family separations. So both of those are patently false. And, you know, it was an issue that we had to fact check many, many times until it finally caught on and got a lot of attention.
All right, and then the rest of the issue chapters are ones that I wrote. I'll go through them quickly. First, economics and trade, which is, of course, a big issue for the president. He used to have a pretty good economy. It was going up on an upward slope when he became president, though he ran for president saying the economy was a disaster. You know, his most repeated claim ever that we have fact checked, it's now up almost 350 times, I believe, is that he presided over the best economy in U.S. history. It's not. No matter how you slice it, no matter what data you look at, you know, the common way is to look at, you know, increase in the gross domestic product. You know, Bill Clinton, Lyndon Johnson, Dwight Eisenhower, among recent presidents, all had better booming economies than Trump. Now, of course, it's not that same kind of situation in the wake of the pandemic. So Trump has actually adjusted his claim. He no longer says he has the best economy in U.S. history. He says he used to have the best economy in world history. Once he actually said he had the best economy in the universe, which
I think Mars would have something to say about that.
We say in the book the residents of Tralfamadore might disagree. We also talk in that I also write in that chapter about his trade falsehoods. There were many. The next chapter is about foreign policy. This is an area where the president feels, I mean, I used to cover foreign policy. I spent 9 years covering the State Department for the Washington Post. You know, there's a way to do diplomacy. The president is more like bull in China shop, which is actually, I just thought there was a Trump ad where they actually bragged about the fact that he was a bull in a China shop. So I guess they can't get mad at me for using that line in the book. And his claims about foreign policy, I go through a variety of different issues, North Korea or Iran or the Middle East. But there's one that I just think is so delightful. The other ones are kind of weighty and interesting, but this one is very delightful. He often says, or he said, it's like more than a dozen times now, that he came up with the idea to face the embassy of Jerusalem, the new embassy in Jerusalem, with Jerusalem stone. Like he called up the ambassador and said, I got a great idea. Why don't you cover it with this stone? It'll make it look really good. Ever since the British Mandate, it has been the law in Jerusalem that you must cover your buildings with Jerusalem stone. It's a particular nice stone with a golden hue. Why does he say this? I don't know. The next issue chapter is about impeachment. I'm particularly pleased with this chapter. I think if you want a good soup to nuts to understand exactly what happened in the impeachment inquiry, I take you through from the beginning to the end in a readable fashion. So impeachment seems maybe about 100 years ago. So when we were writing the book, it was during the impeachment trial. So it seemed awfully relevant. Our world has changed, but I do think people will find that chapter of great interest. The one thing I wanted to highlight in there, which is kind of from the beginning, is his just a comment that he made that, of course, now I can't find it. On his favorite TV show, Fox and Friends, and it had to do with the server and the DNC. And he said, you know, they gave the server to CrowdStrike, whatever it's called. It's a company owned by wealthy Ukrainian, and this FBI has never gotten that server. Why did it go to a Ukrainian company? And the strangest thing about this whole series of things, which is something that he seems to firmly believe, you know, there's a question, is it a lie or not? He seems to believe this. It's kind of a conspiracy theory. Well, the server is not in Ukraine. It's actually at the DNC on display. You know, that they have it on display next to the filing cabinet that the Watergate burglars tried to pry open in 1972. CrowdStrike, the founder, he was born in Russia. He's not Ukrainian. He's never been Ukrainian, and he's a U.S. citizen. And CrowdStrike is not a Ukrainian company. It actually is traded on the NASDAQ stock exchange, and it went public about a month before Trump had his call with the Ukrainian leader. It went up 97% on its first day in trading, so it would have been a good investment. Anyway, that's. But because of his obsession with that, he led himself down a path that led to his impeachment. The final issues chapter is about the coronavirus, which we're all quite familiar with. We're going to lead you through just the strange statements the president made, such as people will think it will go away in April. We only have 15 cases. It shows what a pretty good job we've done. He said that at the end of February, by the end of March, there were 2,500 deaths in the United States. And of course, he blamed, we'd lost Meg for a moment. Oh, there she is. And then, of course, he blamed Barack Obama for all sorts of things that weren't true, such as that he left behind bad tests. How could Obama leave behind a test to test COVID-19? Which was a new disease caused by a new virus. That Obama did a horrible job with the swine flu pandemic, which actually Obama was considered to have done a pretty good job on that. And he strangely referred to these statistics on flu, seasonal flu, which he would twist out of context or use in ways that were not relevant to the situation at hand. There are two other parts of the book. I end with a conclusion. Then Sal takes everyone, the appendix is a tour through one rally, Trump's longest rally ever, and we kind of combined all the various claims that you might have read earlier in the book, as well as some others that we hadn't gotten to. So you can see, Sal takes you through exactly how many things he says that are true, how many things are false. And in the conclusion, I try to assess, what is the impact of Donald Trump on the presidency? It's a bit of a fool's errand to try to figure that out. There was actually an excerpt from this chapter in the Washington Post that appeared online yesterday, and it will be in the Outlook section on Sunday. But part of it depends on whether he's reelected. Because if he's not reelected, people might say this kind of style of truth-telling or not truth-telling doesn't succeed. But I do think that there is some hope to be looking at this, the impact of Trump on the presidency, because I don't think it's necessarily worked for him. He has terrible ratings in terms of whether people find he's trustworthy. The Washington Post fact checker, we worked with our pollsters to look at whether or not, Trump's biggest repeated falsehoods were actually believed by the American people, and only 1 out of 3 people believed these falsehoods. They weren't even believed by people who are Trump supporters. And we tested this by not identifying that Trump said these things. We just asked people, was this true? Was this a correct statement, or was the opposite the correct statement? In most cases, people picked the correct statement. It's, like I said, it'll depend in part on whether he's reelected. But you already, every action in politics results in a reaction. And so if Trump does not succeed, the next president might say, consistently misleading the American public is not a way to political success. And then Sal will talk briefly about the appendix. I know we want to get to questions.
I thought you summarized it well, but I really encourage everyone to read it if they have the fortitude for it, because it takes a while. It's like, one of the longest chapters here, because we go methodically through every single statement, every claim of fact that Trump makes during the rally. right? So he speaks for 2 hours. We don't focus on the chaff, the trivialities, opinions. We take every claim of fact that he makes, and we assess whether it's true, false, or misleading, or somewhere in there, and we categorize them. And just very briefly, to give you guys a taste, the analysis showed that from a grand total of 179 statements, 120 were false, mostly false or unsupported by evidence. So you can take that to mean that at a Trump rally, 2/3 of what the president says is false or misleading. And that was his best score. We've done this analysis 3 times, and 2/3 is his best. He's usually a little bit over than that.
All right. I see we have lots of questions. I've been scrolling through them. This is an interesting one. Do you think Trump is clueless, or is he deliberate in his comments and his actions? And that is a fascinating question, because we struggle with this. This is why we don't often use the word lie. And the interesting thing about Trump is he is situational. And he only lives for the moment. So he doesn't feel any need to worry about whether or not he's contradicting something that he said literally 24 hours beforehand. Now, does that mean he's just being tactical, or does he, actually convince himself that what he's saying now is the truth? And we noticed that in the Ukraine investigation, that whole bit about CrowdStrike, and even Fox and Friends were saying, "Are you sure about this?" And he just repeated it. Like, he's convinced himself that actually it was a Ukrainian company and the server was somehow in Ukraine, and they caused the interference in the 2016 election. So, and he has a tendency to believe these conspiracy theories. So we were talking about Joe Scarborough. That sounds like a total lie, you could say. How would anyone believe this? But he seems to have convinced himself it's true. I don't know if either of you want to take another question, or we just...
I found this one to be interesting from Mark Cohen. To what extent do you think that aides, advisors to Trump talk to him about any of the lies to try to urge him to moderate his mendacity? It's a good question, because you would imagine, that this would be a huge liability for any president seeking re-election. Like, there's a database by the Washington Post that says you've lied 19,000 times. How do we sell that to the public? But there's some evidence. We see reporting sometimes that his aides, sometimes anonymously, are saying that they tried to steer him away from this falsehood or from that conspiracy theory, and they just couldn't convince the president to do it. And also, we see it reflected sometimes in, sometimes we will fact check an economic claim, right? Let's say about the black unemployment rate or something having to do with manufacturing jobs during the Obama administration. And we will notice that after he's fact checked, perhaps because someone alerted him to it, he will tweak the wording in such a way that it's still not quite there, but it gets him into safer, more accurate territory. But generally, no. I mean, he does not desist from. I mean, you see the Scarborough thing playing out.
Right. Meg, is there one you want to take?
I saw one and now I've lost it, but it was something about how often does he delete tweets? And we actually have that statistic for the first 3 years, and I think it's about 500 tweets that he deleted. So he has a tendency to sort of retweet people and quote tweet people a lot. And I should note that we don't fact check his retweets, because it's something that someone else has said, and it's sort of like a factual, it's not him saying it per se, but we do fact check things when he quote tweets, and obviously when he does tweet. So that was one thing that caught my eye.
All right, there was one I saw. What is Trump's average Pinocchio score? This is not something we've actually calculated, but there are a couple of things I can say, which is that generally a politician that we fact check on a regular basis gets 4 Pinocchios about 15 to 20% of the time. I think Barack Obama was about 18%. Hillary was in that same range. During the 2016 campaign, which is when I did calculate this, Trump got 4 Pinocchios 65% of the time. And the only person who had ever been close to that was Michelle Bachmann, a congresswoman from Minnesota. And she got 4 Pinocchios 30% of the time. So Trump was twice as bad as Bachmann. And his record as president has not been any better. There was a point in October this year where I calculated he had already received more than 1,000 Pinocchios. And he actually breaks the scale. He's gotten more Pinocchios all by himself than all other Republicans combined over the 9 years that I have been doing this. So, someone want to take another one?
I see a couple of questions inquiring about our mental health, and I just want to assure people that we're fine. It is a little bit, there's a little bit of an element of fatigue and repetitiveness. There's some tedium involved when you're working on the database, not so much the book. The book was a wonderful thing to be able to work on and collaborate with Glenn and Meg on. But when you're fact checking, every single thing the president says, there's an element of repetitiveness that sort of gets to you. But I don't really, see that, it brings us down or, we have, obviously, we're humans and we process politics like everyone else, but it's also our job and there's 100 things to worry about. And we just keep moving forward because the president never stops. So I would just assure everyone that we're all okay.
But I'll just add to that the database, we did not expect it to be such an all-consuming thing. It started out as a 100-day project, working with Sal's predecessor, who had originally suggested the idea of doing the database. And we did it in part because we try to write a lot about policy in depth. And the fact checks are simply a jumping off point to explain complex issues to people. And we didn't want to be bogged down with Trump, who would say things that you can fact check in a couple of lines. And so we thought, well, this is a way we can keep focused on important issues and just throw that Trump tweet into the database. And he was doing it about 5 or 6 claims a day. It seemed manageable when we said, oh, we'll do it for another year. Same thing happened for another year. And we said, all right, well, we'll do it for the rest of his presidency. And then he effectively became his own press secretary. They stopped giving White House briefings and the claims just exploded. So the thing that it may, is we just lost too many weekends and weeknights, evenings, to trying to keep up this database. There's a big difference between adding in 6 claims a day and adding in 22 claims a day, or if it's a rally, it can be 60, 70, 100 claims.
Yeah, I think that the statistics for sort of the comparison between the first 2 years and the third year of Trump's first 3 years really sort of clarifies that. He made more false or misleading claims in his third year than he did in his first 2 combined. There was a particular month in 2018 that Sal and I both remember quite well. Glenn was on vacation and Trump casually decided to double his rate of claims. And we just suddenly felt like, the sky was falling in, but we weren't quite sure why. And when the numbers came out, it was really, really clear why we were scrambling so much.
So I just held up.
He never turned back also.
I just held up the graphic we have in here. And I should note the book is filled with, between each chapter, we have little amusing graphics that I think people will find of interest. So this page I was holding up was showing factories that Trump claimed he was responsible for having been built, that he opened, which he had nothing to do with. Anyway, it's just little nuggets that we didn't fit somewhere else, but it's just intended to keep it somewhat light and amusing. As the blurb says on the back, the book is grimly funny. So we tried to have a light hand as we went through this.
So I see a question here. It's the most popular one. What is the most dangerous fact check or false statement from Trump? And I have 2 answers to that. I would say that recently, and I would direct everyone to go to our website, Meg and a few of her colleagues and Glenn did this excellent video fact check about Trump's claims about hydroxychloroquine, right? This drug that the FDA now says could cause heart disease, right? And Trump for 2 months, and still occasionally now talks about it as a possible remedy for the novel coronavirus. So that one comes to mind. There's, as Glenn said, there's a coronavirus chapter in the book as well. And the other answer that I'd like to give is that I think with Trump, it's not so much that there's one, as the introduction sort of lays out, and Glenn was saying, there's not so much that there's one big falsehood, one big lie, just the constant wearing down of every segment of society that he sort of speaks about that needs to be fact checking him. The constant misinformation on every single issue, that comes across him. That does a lot to shake, faith in democracy, which isn't so much dangerous like taking hydroxychloroquine might be for someone with a poor heart. But there are long-term implications from this latter, assault on the truth that he does too. It breeds distrust. People won't trust the media, their local post office, the schools, the state government, right? And that has long-term repercussions, just the volume and number of false claims.
Right. I think that's an excellent answer. I mean, you could see, his rhetoric about how the media is the enemy of the people. And now just this past week, you see reporters being attacked, sometimes brutally, by either law enforcement officers or sometimes protesters. And that, I think that's a legacy of the kind of rhetoric that the president uses. And I was recently asked in an interview, was there an issue in which Trump spoke the truth ever? And actually the answer is, I cannot think of one. There's not one single issue where the president, you could say, consistently is honest. And that's a disturbing thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you start to think about the sort of scale and scope of the falsehoods that he says, that's sort of what's alarming, that it's everything from sort of a minute detail that's sort of a throwaway thing that there's no reason ostensibly to make up, to things that really have significant either health consequences for people or, policy consequences for sort of, global foreign policy. I think that's where it starts to feel like the ground's a bit uneven under all of it.
Let's see. Someone asks, how does Trump compare with Reagan or Bush 1 or Bush 2? Living through those presidencies, my recollection is they lied a lot about very big things. This is, maybe you could say they lied less on myriad, somewhat smaller things, but still sold serious lies on big things. Well, like we said, every president lies at some point. And there are definitely big things that come to mind. In the case of Reagan, there was the Iran-Contra affair. In the case of George W. Bush, there were weapons of mass destruction. But you can, his supporters would argue he just was misled, or he allowed himself to be misled by the intelligence, or he didn't look more carefully at it. The question is that a lie, or is that hoping things to be the way they are? The United States did go to war based on that intelligence. But this, I really, Trump is just in another realm, truly. And one of the reasons why he's in another realm, compared to those other presidents, Trump does not really rely on the expertise of the government. You may feel like George W. Bush, took us to war on false pretenses, but he did rely on intelligence that was in the developed by the CIA. Now, again, in Trump's case, there are things he says that don't come out of the intelligence agencies. And in fact, in the case of the pandemic, the intelligence agencies were telling him this was a serious problem, but he wanted to wish it away. So he wasn't even paying attention to what they were saying. And then he spent weeks telling the American public it was going away, even as his health advisors were saying this was potentially a very serious public health issue. Let's see. Well, we have 6 more minutes or so, 5 more minutes. Are there other? What role should social media platforms play in fact-checking Trump? What is? Does someone want to take that? Or I can
You know, I think it's an interesting question. We're seeing it all play out with Twitter and Facebook right now. You know, Twitter has started, right, appending these, what I think are, you know, I mean, insufficient little lines at the bottom that link to a separate page that fact checks, you know, some of what the president is saying. And the first time they did it, it was a vote by mail claim. I mean, the president has been saying a lot of false and misleading things about vote by mail lately. He is laboring under the assumption, we all believe, that vote by mail predominantly helps Democrats, not Republicans, in some of these states that he hopes to clinch victory in November. That's not certain. We don't know whether vote by mail helps Republicans more than Democrats. But the president thinks so, and Twitter fact-checked him over it. And then they appended a second warning, you know, to one of his tweets when he tweeted the line, you know, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, right, which has a racist history of its own. And so they appended a warning to that. There's been a lot of debate. Obviously, you know, what role are the social media companies publishers, and do they have responsibilities like the Washington Post has, you know, to avoid recklessly, you know, slandering people and to, you know, police the content on its pages and on its website? Or are they not a publisher? Are they just, you know, a tech company with a platform, and they have no responsibility over the third parties and what they're saying on there? No matter what you do, no matter what the solution is, whether Twitter hires a bunch of fact checkers or independent fact checkers come in and take over, or the government decides to regulate, you can't draw up hedges around Donald Trump. The president has a huge megaphone, and he bears responsibility for what he says, right? So you can, I think ultimately all these policies try to tackle a problem that at its root begins and ends with the president.
Right. Totally agree with that. Let's see. How do we make sure this information is known by every voter? He lies with impunity, and people seem to forget about it the next day or with the next lie. Well, I think the answer is that everyone should get a copy of this book for Father's Day, and or for or their or for their friends. You know, I mean, we write these fact checks to give people information. What they do with it, we can't control. There's a lot of evidence. I mean, there have been studies shown that fact checks actually make Trump supporters better informed, but it doesn't change their opinion of the president. There have been data showing that while 15 years ago, Democrats and Republicans, the same percentage thought that it was important for a president to always tell the truth. When we redid that poll recently, it was still 70% for Democrats and Republicans. It was only 49% for Republicans, which indicates that they realize that the president is not telling the truth, but they still support him for other political reasons. So, that's the nature of our society. The country has gotten much more partisan. Trump has exacerbated that partisanship. Another figure that I cite in the conclusion, which I think is fascinating, is in 1960, 5% of Democrats and Republicans said they would be upset if their child married someone from a different political party. That study done now shows that as much as 45% would be upset if their children married someone from a different political party. They would be more upset if their child married someone from a different political party. Then they would be upset if the child married someone from a different race, from a different religion, or even if the child married someone of the same sex. So that shows how much political identification has become so much a part of how Americans view themselves. And Trump, I believe, unfortunately, has really exacerbated that by simply painting the other side as an enemy and someone to be defeated, and he's using falsehoods to make those claims, as opposed to trying to bring the American public together and to try to actually say, we shouldn't be such a split society. He lives on those splits.
And just a small plug, I would say another thing that we do, aside from sort of, the columns that you're familiar with in the paper and online, is we've really expanded where the fact checks live. So we have a YouTube series that, covers a lot of sort of bigger topics and visual depth. We publish our videos on Facebook. We publish our videos on the Post site. We also have been on Snapchat and sort of Instagram. So really trying to sort of spread information to voters who are getting their information in all different locations.
Right. In fact, I should say that more people watch fact checker videos than actually read the written fact checks. So this has been a huge success for us at the Washington Post, in large part due to Meg and her colleagues on the video team, and something I'm personally very proud of. And these videos are really astonishing. There was a video we did having to do with where did the Wuhan virus come from? Where in Wuhan did the virus come from? And that video got more than 2 million views on YouTube. I don't know where we are on the time here.
Oh, I think we're
Oh, there's Brad. Okay.
running close.
Yeah, well, look, thanks, Glenn, Sal, and Meg for truly a great and illuminating discussion. You know, the work you do sounds so exhausting, but it's so important, and it's reassuring to hear that you're all still okay. And one thing is most definitely true. The three of you are going to stay very, very busy fact-checking Trump through at least the rest of this year. Again, the title of their book is Donald Trump and His Assault on Truth. And you can get a copy or several by clicking on the green bar at the bottom of your screens. And thanks again to everyone for tuning in. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.